Welcome, everyone, to the event, the panel on Silencing Dissent, the Islamophobia Industry's Assault on Academic Freedom, hosted by the Rutgers Law Center for Security, Race, and Rights, the Georgetown University Bridge Initiative, and the Georgetown University Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. These three academic centers are among the very few handful of academic centers nationwide whose mission is to focus on combating Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Arab racism. And yet these institutions, among the few others who have the same mission, have been subjected to the most vicious attacks by the very same Islamophobia industry and Islamophobic politicians that have caused these centers to work on this very subject to stop discrimination against Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian communities in the United States. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and also the director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the first and only academic research center at a law school that engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. Our work is organized around three themes: the contemporary and historical intersection of race and religion in the United States, the criminalization of Muslim identity through US and global national security laws and policies, and transnational rights and security arising from relations between the United States and Muslim majority countries. And each of these themes is examined to analyze how racism, securitization, and dehumanization operate to produce Islamophobia and racism against Arab and South Asian communities in the United States and abroad. Co-sponsoring the event is the Georgetown Bridge Initiative, which is a multi-year research project on Islamophobia housed in Georgetown University. The Bridge Initiative aims to disseminate original and accessible research, offer engaging analysis and commentary on contemporary issues, and host a wide repository of educational resources to inform the general public about Islamophobia. And finally, the third co-sponsor of this event, Silencing Dissent, the Islamophobia Industry's Assault on Academic Freedom, is the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, which has become internationally recognized as a leader in the study of the history of Muslim-Christian relations and promotion of improved relations through dialogue. The center reflects Georgetown University's Jesuit heritage and recognition of the importance of religion in contemporary international affairs. The global presence and impact of Islam is a fact of international life, and understanding Muslim-Christian relations in global affairs is a focal concern for the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And we will be organizing today's panel as follows. Ms. Mubashara Tazamel will go first, and then I, Professor Sahar Aziz, will go second, and then Professor Nader Hashmi will go third. So let me first introduce our first speaker, Mubashara Tazamel, who is the Associate Director of the Bridge Initiative, a research project on Islamophobia at Georgetown University. She is a researcher and freelance writer specializing in the impact of the war on terror, discourse, and state-sponsored Islamophobia worldwide, particularly how mis- and disinformation and the state play a role in fomenting anti-Muslim hatred. As an expert in the field, Ms. Tazamel serves as a key resource for educators and journalists, with her analysis cited in major global outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Al Jazeera. In addition to producing reports and articles for Bridge Initiative, her work has been featured in various mainstream media outlets. She holds a master's degree from SOAS, the University of London, and has a background in human rights and advocacy and immigration law. Mubashara, welcome, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Aziz, and thank you everyone for joining us for this very important and timely topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Islamophobia industry. And what do we mean when we talk about this industry? It's a loose network of individuals, think tanks, media outlets, political actors, all of who play a role in manufacturing, producing, and/or circulating anti-Muslim rhetoric. These groups and voices amplify anti-Muslim stereotypes and tropes. They spread mis and disinformation and have played a role in introducing and advocating for policies, for discriminatory policies targeting Muslims. And they often do this for political and or financial gain. Just to give you a little bit of background on the financial part of this industry, a 2022 report by the Council on American Islamic Relations found that over $1 billion was poured into 26 Islamophobia network groups between 2017 and 2019. And these groups used this funding to spread misinformation and conspiracy theories about Islam and Muslims that demonize these communities and result in pushing for harmful policies. And I want to point out this industry isn't limited to the United States. Unfortunately, there are anti-Muslim voices and groups across the globe, and that's because Islamophobia has become mainstream. And in many countries across the globe, they play a role with the government in pushing forth harmful policies. And so the intersections with pro-Israeli special interest groups are there as well. What we've observed at Bridge is that many of these groups that produce, amplify, and circulate Islamophobic narratives also advocate for pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian policies. As Bridge noted in our recent piece, several of the organizations that played a role in this smearing campaign against Dr. Badr Hansuri seek to criminalize pro-Palestinian voices while also promoting Islamophobic narratives. To demonstrate this overlap, many of the individuals on the boards of some of these organizations are the same people. So, i.e., one person who works for Middle East Forum sits on the board of Camera, and so on and so forth. And there are also numerous intersection in terms of sharing the same staff and also funding. Many of the funders behind these groups not only fund pro-Israel lobbying groups in the US, but also groups whose main objective it is to demonize Islam and Muslims and advocate for harmful and unconstitutional policies. And one group is the Middle East Forum. Along with Middle East Forum, other groups involved in both promoting pro-Israel policies and Islamophobia include the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and the Center for Security Policies. And we have fact sheets on many of these organizations that I'm going to name on the Bridge website. Individuals also include Daniel Pipes, who is the founder of Middle East Forum, and Frank Gaffney, who's the founder of Center for Security Policies. And these individuals themselves have also, in turn, supported and financed several other anti-Muslim voices. And donors who fund these groups and advocate an aggressive pro-Israel policy and anti-Palestinian policies include the Sheldon Adelson Foundation, the Abstraction Fund, formerly the William Rosenwald Family Organization, the Sarah Scaife Foundation, and the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation. And there are many others. I'm just naming a few. I'm going to do a quick case study on Canary Mission because it's an organization that's in the headlines right now. But I want to note that Canary Missions, what it does isn't necessarily novel. I want to take it back to Middle East Forum's Campus Watch, which is the project that was established in 2002. And I call it the original Canary Mission because it's engaged in harassing, blacklisting, intimidating scholars and students critical of Israel. And given that the Trump administration's announced to publicly go after Middle East studies departments across American universities, it's not far-fetched to believe that Middle East Forum will be providing the government with an outline of who and what department to go after. I want to note that Anna Stanley, who wrote the original piece smearing Badr Hansuri, works for Middle East Forum, and she took credit publicly for his arrest. And in her piece, she invoked a lot of Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian tropes. And she's also publicly stated on Twitter that she will be sure to provide quote unquote more information to DHS regarding Dr. Suri's case. And I provide this background again to demonstrate that Canary Mission isn't doing something that's novel or new and isn't the only organization doing these things, but rather it's built on what established anti-Muslim organizations have been doing for at least 20 years. The difference today is that there is a very receptive administration that's listening to these groups. So a little look at Canary Mission. It was established in 2014 and is essentially a doxing website. It monitors and smears pro-Palestinian students and academics, and it deploys Islamophobic narratives to do so, either accusing them of terrorism or extremism or anti-Semitism. And these profiles, I want to point out, have been used by the Israeli government. And it was reported that several of the students that have been arrested by the Trump administration, including Mahmoud Halil, had profiles on Canary Mission. A 2018 investigation by The Forward revealed that a major donor to Canary Mission was a foundation controlled by the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, a major Jewish charity with an annual budget of over $100 million. And the investigation found that the federation, through another foundation, the Helen Diller Family Foundation, gave $100,000 to Canary Mission. Another 2018 investigation by Myrav Zonzain for 917 magazine found that the San Francisco Federation, both directly and through the Diller Foundation, funded several other right-wing and anti-Muslim groups through grants over the years, including Project Veritas, the American Freedom Law Center, which I believe about a decade ago was the organization that was introducing the quote anti-Sharia legislation, the American Freedom Defense Initiative, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and the work of Islamophobic Dutch politician Geert Wilders. Other groups also include the Clarion Fund, the Center for Security Policy, and the Middle East Forum. And we have fact sheets on the Bridge website on many of these organizations and individuals. Another 2015 report from the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network revealed the financing behind the attacks across the U.S. against pro-Palestine voices. And it found that individual donors and their foundations masked their involvement in funding Zionist backlash and Islamophobia through providing grants to donor-advised funds, community foundations, and other intermediaries. And one major intermediary the report highlights is Daniel Pipes' Middle East Forum. And the report described the organization as a key part of the Backlash Network, as well as the Islamophobia Network. And MEF received funding from 8 of the 11 major donors the report outlined, and in turn, MEF itself funded over a dozen other Zionist and Islamophobic outlets. When it comes to narratives, both the Islamophobia industry and certain pro-Israel advocacy groups, and again, I would argue these often overlap, seek to portray Muslim political activism as inherently linked to terrorism or extremism and tying it to anti-Semitism. Dissent and activism by Muslims, especially visible Muslims, is constructed as a threat. And this tying of Islam and Muslims' identity to violence is a hallmark of post 9/11 war on terror discourse, which mainstreamed, during that time period, it mainstreamed this narrative. Along with tying political activism and support for Palestinian rights and criticism of the Israeli government to terrorism and extremism, these groups and voices also frame Muslims as a, quote, civilizational threat. This Islamophobic narrative has been present for centuries, actually, and is rooted in Orientalist and racist attitudes that view Muslims, Arabs, who, by the way, are not all Muslims, as quote, the other vis-a-vis the West. Muslims and Arabs are ascribed with negative and harmful traits, such as being backwards, violent, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. And the West is framed as democratic and progressive and whatever. The civilization threat is often invoked. This narrative is often invoked when politicians or certain voices will talk about, quote, Western values and, quote, Judeo-Christian values. Just so to round up my talk, when it comes to Palestine and pro-Palestinian advocacy, the Islamophobia industry and pro-Israel groups, which often overlap, utilize these narratives to smear pro-Palestine voices of supporting violence or extremism and accusing them of terrorism.
Thank you, Mubashara, for that very helpful background for us to understand that what we're witnessing today, which is highly racialized and targeted against Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, and their allies, particularly when they are from the global South, is not new. And it is part of the post 9/11 era. And it's also a pre 9/11 problem. So I will use a PowerPoint to for my time to present. So give me a second while I bring it up. Okay. All right. So let me just give the usual disclaimers and advance notice. If you feel uncomfortable, offended, or unsafe, please be advised that you are free to leave now or at any time during the presentation. Your attendance here is voluntary and signifies your consent to listen and expose yourself to the ideas in this presentation and this panel. By voluntarily listening to this presentation, you are assuming the risk of being offended, feeling uncomfortable, disagreeing with the ideas proffered, and any other psychological or emotional responses. No content in this presentation is intended to harm physically, psychologically, or materially Jews, Muslims, Palestinians, or any other persons. And finally, the views expressed do not represent the views of Rutgers University or Rutgers Law School. So let's just start by talking about why we even are having this panel today and why the Islamophobia industry has been so virulent, so vicious in targeting the academic freedom of Muslim civil rights groups and combating Islamophobia groups and Muslim, Palestinian, Arab faculty members and their diverse allies. Well, it is because American students of all races, ethnicities, and religious identities, including Jewish Americans, are protesting on college campuses and have been doing so since October 7, 2023. And their demands, or what they are seeking in those protests and what is motivating them, is a demand for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, to stop Israel's bombing of hospitals in Gaza. The last functioning hospital just got destroyed a few days ago, to stop Israel's bombing of UN shelters in Gaza, to stop Israel's bombing of schools and universities in Gaza, to stop targeted assassinations of Palestinian journalists, to stop the killing of Palestinians by the Israeli military, which has now reached at least 51,000 plus over 10,000 unidentified killed under the rubble, including 18,000 children that have been killed by the Israeli military. To stop Israel's systematic starvation of Palestinians since October 8th, 2023, to persuade the US government, their government, to publicly condemn Israel's disproportionately violent and collective punishment of all Palestinians in Gaza for the Hamas attacks in Israel on October 7, 2023, to persuade their government, the US government, to stop funding the Israeli military and by extension, Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. And finally, to persuade their government, the US government, to pressure Israel into entering a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and return of the Israeli hostages. That is why we're here. And that is the speech and the thought and the protest and political activism that the Islamophobia industry wants to quash, punish, and censor. So how are they, how can we think about this in broad terms? So first, the anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia is driving the attacks on academic freedom in American higher education. Now, granted, there's also anti-DEI motivations. There's also anti-liberal liberal arts or liberal universities agendas by the conservatives. But the head of the spear, the point of the spear, and what is most salient among the American population is, unfortunately, anti-Palestinian racism. And as a result, Republican politicians are exploiting the pervasive anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia in American society to further their broader anti-liberal arts education and anti-DEI agenda. Simultaneously, these organizations self-describe themselves as pro-Israeli and American Zionist organizations, are actively interfering in the administration of higher education through lawfare, donor coercion, and public smear campaigns against university presidents and faculty and students. The first targets are Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students and faculty, which then sets a precedent for violating the academic freedom and free speech rights of anti-Zionist Jewish students and professors, which we are starting to see an increasing number. And finally, I will talk a little bit more later in my presentation, the Rutgers Law School Center for Security Rights has been a target of these vicious and racist attacks because its mission is to combat Islamophobia and to combat racism against Arabs, Palestinians, and South Asians, and that includes anti-Palestinian racism. And its mission is to be treated equally. So let me just state the obvious, which we had hoped, those of us who have been studying Islamophobia since 9/11 and who have written many articles and books, that this would have become something that is now unacceptable normatively. Just like there are anti-Semitic tropes against Jews, there are anti-Muslim racial tropes against Muslims. And these tropes should not be accepted as something that is normal, right? These are racist tropes and they should be questioned, and they should at the very least be socially condemned in the same way that one would condemn racist tropes against Black people, Jewish people, Latino people, and other minorities. So the first most common one is that Muslims are terrorists or terrorist supporters. So that's why you're seeing a lot of these Islamophobia groups arguing or claiming that anyone who demands the human rights of Palestinians to be protected, or that criticizes the genocidal campaign in Israel, that all of those people are Hamas supporters, terrorist supporters, as opposed to human rights defenders, right? Or as opposed to people who do not support violence against civilians or collective punishment. Another racist trope is that Muslims are hateful and violent, that Muslims are illiberal and anti-democratic, that Muslims are misogynistic and anti-women, and that Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic. That's a very common racist trope. And with that, I will point you to our report, Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, for a full examination of that racist trope, which was co-authored by Mitchell Plitnick and myself. And then finally, anti-Palestinian racist tropes mirror Islamophobic tropes, which is why you can't really examine one without the other, especially at this moment in time. And today is April 16th, 2025. Now, I want to now talk a little bit about, just at a very broad level, what is academic freedom and why we care about it so much in the United States, in a country that claims to be the beacon of democracy, in a country that prides itself in freedom and liberty, and in fact has spent billions of dollars trying to spread that ideology across the world. First is that we believe in the US, it's a fundamental American value, that teachers, researchers, and students have the right to explore, teach, and discuss ideas without undue interference or restriction from external forces like governments, institutions, or public pressure. We also believe that researchers should be able to present their findings, publish their work, and teach in ways they deem professionally appropriate, while students have the freedom to study and express their opinions on subjects of interest, which is exactly what we're doing today in this panel discussion, which will likely trigger a campaign of hate and smear campaigns against me and the other speakers, as well as the centers that are co-sponsoring it. So those very entities and people admit they oppose the fundamental American principle of academic freedom. And then finally, academic freedom is important for the free exchange of ideas, because that is essential for the advancement of knowledge and informed self-governance. Now, let me just highlight a quote by Justice William Brennan, Supreme Court Justice, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, in the seminal case Keishian v. Board of Regents, which was issued, the opinion was issued in 1967. He states, "Our nation is deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, which is of transcendent value to all of us." So it's not just valuable to the teachers and the professors, and not merely to the teachers concerned. That freedom is therefore a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. Now, in the Keishian v. Board of Regents case, it involved State University of New York rule or a law in New York that required teachers to have to sign an oath that they did not support subversive activities. They were not members, for example, of the Communist Party, and this was part of the McCarthyist era during the Cold War. That provision was struck down by the Supreme Court in this case. One of the important kind of takeaways among many others in the case is that the Supreme Court recognized the chilling effect caused by vague laws restricting free speech, and also rejected that public employment may be conditioned upon the surrender of constitutional rights, which could not be abridged otherwise by direct government action. But unfortunately, the Islamophobia industry does not seem to believe that Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, South Asians, and their allies have those same constitutional rights. Another seminal Supreme Court case is United States v. Associated Press, which was issued in 1945. And in just some important quotes that I'm pulling out so you understand why these are fundamental American values. In that case, the Supreme Court described the classroom as peculiarly the marketplace of ideas, because the nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas, which discovers truth out of a multitude of tongues rather than through any kind of authoritative selection. And then finally, in Sweezy v. New Hampshire, another seminal case on academic freedom, issued in 1957, Chief Justice Earl Warren stated, "The essentiality of freedom in the community of American universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation." He goes on to say, "No field of education is so thoroughly comprehended by man that new discoveries cannot yet be made. Particularly is that true in the social sciences, where few, if any, principles are accepted as absolutes." And finally, he states, "Scholarship cannot flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. Teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die." End quote. So this is exactly what the Trump administration wants, and the Islamophobia industry wants, and the anti-Palestinian racist groups want, is they want us, their targets anyway, not to have academic freedom, not to have free speech. And what we need to understand is the direct victims, the most immediate people harmed are the Muslims, the Arabs, the Palestinians, students, faculty, immigrants. But the broader harm is to us all in the long run and to our society, which is precisely why the Supreme Court starting in the 1940s, and continuing to the 1950s and 1960s, has been very clear that academic freedom is a fundamental constitutional right under the First Amendment. Now, I'm not going, it's a separate presentation to talk about the First Amendment, but I just want to highlight the key principles that are important, especially for the non-lawyers, to keep in mind when determining the enforcement of free speech rights. The first is that the U.S. Constitution, or the First Amendment, as it's been interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court, prohibits content-based regulations. It has to be viewpoint neutral. It must be content neutral if there is going to be regulation of speech, whether it's pure speech or expressive speech. Now, there is there is a allowance for reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions that must apply to everyone and every entity, again, in a content neutral way. They must be reasonable, and they cannot be imposed as pretext for content-based discrimination, which is a question that many of us have in the post-October 2023 environment, when universities were passing all sorts of quite restrictive time, place, and manner restrictions that were never invoked, or were never passed, or never existed in the decades prior, but only suddenly came about in response to demands that the Palestinian human rights protests and panels and events be canceled and shut down. And then finally, if there is a showing of a clear and present danger, means an immediate danger of violence that is caused by speech, that could be a basis for quote unquote censorship. Okay, so as a result, let me just remind all of us what we learned in American schools. It is American to dissent. It is American to criticize your government. It is American to defend individual freedoms. It is American to fight against oppression by the government. And it is American to exercise your free speech rights, even and especially if your beliefs are unpopular. This is considered and taught to students in American schools, that this is a form of patriotism. This is you exercising your constitutional rights. The problem is that there seems to be these exceptions. Now, it's not written in law, but it is in fact enforced in practice. And the Trump administration and the Islamophobia industry has admitted that in fact they would like that to also be in the law. So if you are a Palestinian, a Muslim, or an Arab who dissents against US foreign policy in Palestine, criticizes the US government, support for Israel's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, you participate in political protests dissenting against US foreign policy, or you practice your academic freedom to conduct research, host programs, and teach courses with ideas that may be critical of Zionism, of Israel, of US foreign policy, and US immigration policy, then suddenly you're not a loyal American. You are a threat to national security. You are a terrorist supporter, and so on and so forth. So you can see these double standards, and that's effectively how racism operates. So let me just quickly go over a case study of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism that we've seen over the last 18 months in the United States. If you look at the objectives of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students, and then you compare that to the objectives of pro-Israeli, again, self-described pro-Israeli Jewish and Zionist organizations, students, and parents, you will see the disconnect. So first, as I had stated earlier in my presentation, the objectives of the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students and their diverse allies, including Jewish American students, they want a ceasefire. They want to stop US foreign military aid to Israel that, in their view, allows and facilitates the genocide in Gaza. They want to divest from companies that provide military assistance to Israel. They want to defend academic freedom and free speech. And they want to protect Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian students from discrimination by self-described pro-Israeli Zionist students, professors, and external organizations. Now, the objectives of the pro-Israeli Jewish and Zionist organizations, students, and parents is, one, they've expressed their support for Israel's war on Gaza. They presume and accuse all Palestinians in Gaza of supporting Hamas. They accuse and label pro-Palestinian protesters as terrorist supporters. They describe pro-Palestinian protests, teach-ins, sit-ins, and encampments as anti-Semitic. They presume Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims hate Jews if they criticize Israeli state policies and practices or contextualize Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And finally, they demand the discipline, expulsion, prosecution, and now deportation of pro-Palestinian students and faculty. And so what I just want to note is on the left-hand side, there is nothing in there that explicitly states that they want to hurt Jews. There's nothing in the objectives of the Palestinian Arab Muslim students and their diverse allies that they are seeking to hurt Jewish Americans in the United States. This is very much focused on stopping what they believe is a genocide occurring in Gaza, funded by their government. So what have been the responses to such political activism by universities, by the government, by the U.S. House Committee on Education and Workforce, which I think should be properly labeled as U.S. House Un-American Activities Committee? Well, they are demanding, and they are in fact seeking disciplinary actions, including expulsion of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities from universities. They want to pass new policies, again, severely restricting time, place, and manner of campus activism, mass arrests of college students by police departments, and delayed response or no response at all to violence committed against them, against the Muslim, Arab, Palestinian students by Zionist organizations and students. So we're also seeing disparity in enforcement of policies. They are violently removing the encampments. There's no acknowledgement or recognition of the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism on college campuses and in American society. There is no or very few university task forces to counter Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian racism. There are a slew of Title VI investigations under the U.S. Department of Education, and now we are seeing visa revocations, immigration detention, and deportation in retaliation for writing op-eds, participating in peaceful protests, and dissenting against government policies. What are the responses to demands of pro-Israeli Jewish and Zionist students and their parents? They're getting congressional hearings about universities, accusing them of promoting and enabling anti-Semitism on campus. There are congressional resolutions condemning anti-Semitism. There are no congressional resolutions condemning anti-Palestinian racism or Islamophobia. Why don't we have both? There are congressional bills to strip nonprofit organizations of tax-exempt status for participating in nonviolent political activism in defense of Palestinian human rights. And there's an approval of $28 billion thus far in military aid to Israel. And also, there are Title VI investigations. There's establishments of university task forces on anti-Semitism. Law firms have rescinded offers to law students for pro-Palestinian speech and political activism. There have been smear campaigns against Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim professors. And there has been a prioritizing and a privileging of Zionist students' subjective feelings and political preferences, even at the expense of the constitutional rights of Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, and anti-Zionist Jewish students and faculty. So again, as you can see, there's, discrimination is about disparate treatment. It's about treating one person better or worse than another similarly situated person on account of their identity. And then when you're dealing with free speech, it's based on their viewpoint and on the content. And so finally, I just want to highlight what's happening here. Here is how you highlight the racialization and dehumanization of Muslim, Palestinian, Arab students and faculty, and contrast that with what would happen if they were humanized. This is how racialization and dehumanization work, and this is the manifestations of it. Effectively, you are treated as untrustworthy. You do not feel pain, trauma, or vulnerability, and if you claim that you do, you're not believed. You're prone to being victims of violence and hate. You are believed to be insincere. You are treated as an outsider. You are undeserving of respect or dignity. You are accused of being a perpetrator of harm. Your preferences and requests are completely ignored. Your experiences are dismissed or denied, and whatever mistakes you may make are fatal, no matter how small. When you are humanized, your feelings of pain, trauma, and vulnerability are recognized. You are told and you are treated as deserving to feel safe. You are deserving of respect and dignity. You are believed as sincere and treated as believable when you complain of when you have grievances. You are a sympathetic victim. Your preferences and requests are prioritized. Your experiences are centered and taken seriously. And whatever mistakes you make, they're forgiven and they're not fatal. Palestinian, Muslim, Arab students and faculty have been treated like the treatment on the left-hand side of the slide, the racialization and humanization. What I would like is for all human beings, regardless of their identity, to be treated like the right-hand side of the screen, the humanization. Okay. Now, these are the authoritarian practices that we've seen, and I'm just going to highlight the four key. Professor Hashmi will discuss more the cases of these students. There are many others, unfortunately, but just for those who are not reading the news, Mahmoud Khalil, Rumsaya Ozturk, Mohsen Mandavi. So Mahmoud Khalil is Palestinian, Mohsen Mahdavi is Palestinian, Rumsaya Ozturk is Turkish, and Badar Khan Suri are Indian. All of them are Muslim, and they all have been effectively abducted by ICE. And the racialized and politically motivated authoritarian practices are as such: immigration detention, visa revocation, green card revocation, arbitrary arrests and abduction by plainclothes masked ICE agents, disappearances for days, moved hundreds of miles away from your family in detention, abuse of executive power to punish political opposition, and unlawful deportations. Now, I put this under authoritarian practices because I happen to also study authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and this is exactly how citizens who dissent against their government are treated in these authoritarian regimes. So the United States is becoming more and more authoritarian based on practices that mirror regimes that have been authoritarian for decades, not just in the Middle East, in other parts of the world as well. But this runs contrary to our fundamental values of freedom, liberty, free speech, academic freedom. This is just, I'll end by highlighting why our center has been attacked, the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, by the Islamophobia industry. And that is primarily because of our mission. We focus on combating racism against Muslims, against Palestinians, against Arabs. And that is anathema to the Islamophobia industry. We humanize Palestinians. We've hosted Palestinian academics and lawyers. I've listed some of them on the screen: Rashid Khalidi from Columbia, Joseph Massad from Columbia, Lara Shihab from George Washington, Noor Erakat from Rutgers, George Bisharat from UC Hastings, Omar Shakir, Human Rights Watch, Raja Shaheda, and Ghada Karmi. All of these are Palestinian scholars and experts. And each time we host a Palestinian scholar and expert, we get attacked and we get accused of being terrorist supporters, Hamas supporters, anti-Semitic. All of these, by the way, these lectures are available on the YouTube channel of CSRR, so I encourage you to watch them for yourself and think for yourself. You can agree, disagree, it's totally up to you. All right, and I've run out of time, so let me just quickly, I'm not going to go through the let me just highlight who has been attacking the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, as well as other organizations, because because a lot of these groups are quite open, they don't hide their hate for Muslims and their hate for Palestinians. We've been attacked by the U.S. Representative Josh Gottheimer, by the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West New Jersey. There are numerous national Zionist organizations who have led concerted hate campaigns. I think at this point, these groups are more accurately described as hate groups based on the hatefulness that they have acted upon towards the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, towards me, and towards many other Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian students at Rutgers. The Zionist Organization of America, End Jew Hatred, Stand With Us, Pens with Swords, Canary Mission, the Anti-Defamation League, and Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism. And then finally, there are House congressional campaigns, committees, who again should be called the House Un-American Activities Committees, because they effectively do not want anyone to dissent against their views. And if they do, they should be prosecuted, deported, punished, disciplined, expelled, fired. These are authoritarians. This is textbook authoritarianism. All right. So I don't have time to go over Title VI because I've run out of time, but I just wanted to end with a quote by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's still Prime Minister. In 2019, among his many quotes, he stated, "Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation state of the Jewish people and only them." And there are many other quotes like this. So these are the type of evidence that may cause people, academics, students, and others, to criticize Zionism, to criticize the nation state of Israel's laws and policies and practices. And there's plenty of other evidence. This is not some, fringe topic. And there are many, many books on the topic. But unfortunately, that is the unspeakable now in the United States if we are allowed, if we allow the attacks on academic freedom to continue. So I'll encourage all of you to be upstanders, because when you are silent, while watch your colleagues, your fellow students, your professors, your universities being attacked, it facilitates the erosion of academic freedom for all of us. And I will just remind everyone of the famous quote by Martin Niemöller, who was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany. And he stated, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for a trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." So it will eventually reach you if it has not already reached you. And so we all need to work together in cross-racial interfaith coalitions based on principles that we share, which is the principle of free speech and academic freedom, dignity, respect, human rights for all, regardless of your identity. And so thank you very much for your time. And now I will transition the panel to my colleague, Professor Nader Hashmi. Give me a second. And just quickly, I do want to give a very quick introduction to Professor Nader Hashmi, who is the director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And his next book project is on the global divide over Israel and Palestine. Professor Hashmi, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Sahar, and thank you everyone for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I have to say, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, given what's happening in our country today, given what's happening with our students today, given what's happening with our democracy today. And I think the topic that brings us here today is germane to all of those questions. So why are academic centers that work on Islamophobia, anti-racism, Middle East studies, why are they coming under attack with such intensity today at this moment? I think broadly speaking, there's two answers to that question. Number one, I think the attack on centers such as the ones that are sponsoring this event and Middle East study centers more broadly across the United States, they're coming under attack because broadly speaking, the other side has lost the public argument. They've lost the public argument on basic questions that have to do with civil rights and human rights and equality for everyone. That's not an argument that they can push back against, because I think most people, particularly younger students, just inherently sort of reject broad attacks on people's identities. They've lost the argument over U.S. foreign policy and what a just U.S. foreign policy can be and should be going forward, especially with respect to the Middle East. And they especially have lost the argument over Israel-Palestine. It's impossible now to defend what Israel is doing against the Palestinians. And so they blame universities, they blame academic research centers. If you go on any American campus, you'll see that the center of gravity of activism and of sympathy is on the side of the Palestinians, not the Israelis. And that deeply upsets racists, bigots, and people on the right of the Israeli spectrum, who are in large part sort of driving a lot of this Islamophobia and Islamophobic attacks on individuals and on academic centers. So there's a lot to say about that topic in and of itself. I want to say something about what's happening at the center that I direct at Georgetown. If there's time left, and there probably won't be, I'd like to speak about the specific case of my detained colleague, Badr Khan Suri, whose image that you saw on the slide that Sahar pointed out just a moment ago. I just happened to actually visit him a couple of days ago at an ICE detention facility in South Texas. I was his immediate supervisor. His story is in parallel to the other stories that you're all more familiar with. Of course, Mahmoud Khalil was the first one, and Rumeysa Öztürk at Tufts was also arrested in very similar circumstances. So there's a lot to say just on those cases. But with respect to the attack on these academic research centers that focus on Islamophobia and on Middle East studies, it's important to, I think, realize that these attacks are not new. Yes, the intensification of them is happening now, largely because there's a sense that this is a unique opportunity with Trump in power, with Rubio as Secretary of State. Now these Islamophobic groups can do what they always wanted to do, but were never able to because there was no administration that was willing to use the coercive power of the state to actually crack down, arrest, silence, and force universities to genuflect before state power. And that's exactly what we have seen at Columbia, where the demands that were made by the Trump administration was basically to, capitulate to our demands, to prostrate in front of power. And one of the key demands was to shut down the Center for Middle East Studies, go after students that were active on the question of Palestine. And unfortunately, Columbia has capitulated. There's a lot of talk today that Harvard is somehow resisting, but if you're following what's happening at Harvard, especially on the case of the Middle East, about 10 days ago, Harvard capitulated on the question of the Middle East, where they summarily fired the senior leadership of the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard, largely, I think, to placate the Trump administration and Netanyahu supporters in the United States. So these are the problems that are happening at this moment. But the point that I want to make is that there's a deeper history here. If you go back, I think at least till in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a lot of attack on universities because they were considered to be bastions of radical independent thought that challenged the state. If you know the history, Richard Nixon did not like the universities because of the protest movements against the Vietnam War. He threatened the universities. When Ronald Reagan was running for governor for the first time, he was vowing to shut down the Berkeley free speech movement. So this type of sort of attitude and sentiment of attacking universities and attacking student activists has a long history. There's a really great piece that I'd like to reference that I just read recently by David Cole, who happens to be my colleague at Georgetown at the law school, where he recalled the story of the LA8, which was a case that has parallels to what's happening right now, but it gives you a sense of the history of what's going on here. In the 1980s, a group of Palestine activists, most of them Palestinian, were sort of arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. And there was a long, protracted trial that took place. And the accusation was back then in the 1980s that these Palestinian students who were arrested and they were first surveilled. There was spies that were planted in their meetings. The charge was that these Palestinian students were involved in an attempt to promote world communism. This was the era of Ronald Reagan. This was when there's all these laws on the books that if you're a member of the Communist Party or associated with the Communist Party, you're an enemy of the state. There was a broad attack on them. And eventually they won their cases, but it took a long time. So this type of sort of, hysteria towards student activism, particularly on the Middle East, and especially on the question of Palestine, has a long history. When you get to the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 1990s, you start to see an intensification of Islamophobic attacks for several reasons. One, the era of the Cold War represented an ideological shift where you could no longer point to the bogey of communism and the Red Scare to rally people. You had to look for new threats. And one of the new threats that people were pointing to was, what Samuel Huntington wrote about, this clash of civilizations, that there was this, war that was going to shape global politics that would be dominated by clashing civilizations, particularly Western civilization versus Islamic civilization. The other event that was happening after the Cold War was the center of gravity of politics in the Middle East was shifting away from the politics of secular nationalism toward religious-based politics and Islamist politics. And it was these political forces that were challenging American foreign policy in the Middle East, and they were challenging specifically America's allies in the Middle East, one of them being Israel. So you start to see these academics, many of them who had PhDs but really couldn't get jobs in American universities because they were so extreme and fanatical in their attitudes toward the politics of the Middle East generally, and Israel-Palestine in particular. And so the quintessential sort of example here is none other than Daniel Pipes himself, who has a PhD in history, but really is a failed academic because he was just completely off the spectrum in his ideas and his attitudes when it came to, Middle East politics and specifically Muslims. So right at the end of the Cold War in 1990, he writes his famous article in the National Interest, and I'm quoting from him where he says that, the threat to the West now, and now that the Cold War has ended, is not coming from some external attack, but it's coming from Muslim immigrants who, quote, are cooking strange foods and maintaining differing standards of hygiene. This is the threat that we have to mobilize against. And these are the people who, have connections, they have financial resources, they have ties to people who are willing to fund their campaigns, and they've gone after universities and academics in particular. One, because I think it's a personal grievance that they can't get jobs in universities, and two, they're very upset that when students come out of universities and they had a good education and a good liberal arts program, they've taken a course in Middle East studies, they've taken a course on the Israel-Palestine conflict, they're asking tough questions. They're showing that they have a nuanced understanding of the world in which they live in. This overlaps with another vector of attack that comes from white nationalists and conservatives and that we've seen in the United States, the whole attack on what's called critical race theory, which is basically, reading history critically from the perspective of marginalized groups who have been historically ignored. There's a convergence of these two sort of trends. White nationalists, people in the Republican Party, but also right-wing Likudniks as well. They have a common view in trying shutting down debate, shutting down critical readings of history, shutting down sort of approaches to the Middle East that sort of look at what's happening in the Middle East from a non-establishment perspective, from the perspective, for example, of this case, of the Palestinians, instead of the perspective of U.S. foreign policy, the perspective of the State of Israel, or the perspective of Arab dictatorial regimes. And I want to sort of also mention that I think the big target here is not Muslims generally. We have to make some distinctions. The attack really is on those Muslims who have independent political ideas, who support international law, and who are willing to think independently outside of a U.S. foreign policy or Israeli framework. So many people in the Islamophobic industry, they have no problem with Muslims such as General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the dictator in Egypt. They have no problem with the Saudi crown prince. They have no problem with, Mohammed bin Zayed, the head of the family dictatorship that runs the United Emirates. They love those Muslims. And they love those Muslims because those Muslims work within an Israeli-centric and an American-centric worldview. What they don't like are those independent political forces in the region that don't work within that framework and have the audacity of defending international law, of standing up for independence, for pursuing foreign policy that reflects the wishes of the people in their own region. That's really the animus. And so you also have these intellectuals who are Muslim or have Muslim connections who are loved by the Islamophobic industry. People like Asra Nomani, people like Ayan Hirsi Ali, people like Zuri Jasser, people like Ed Hussein, et cetera. These are people who, yeah, they're Muslim, but they're loved by the Islamophobic industry. So the real point here is that the attack is a political attack. And the attack on these centers, particularly the center that I'm connected with, which was founded by John Esposito, is an attempt to attack any independent study, analysis, scholarship on the phenomena of political Islam. So when you listen to Daniel Pipes speak these days, he says, I'm not anti-Muslim. I don't hate Muslims. I have a problem with political Islam, with the politicized movements and manifestations that seek to acquire state power and then impose a particular authoritarian order on the region that is bad for the West and is bad for Israel and is bad for the people who live under that order. And, there's an argument to be made. Of course, there are, Muslim politicized groups that have that political agenda, but that's not all there is to political Islam. And so the attack on academic centers like the center that I'm currently the director of is the fanatical attempt to dictate a narrative and a discourse and to prevent any nuanced understanding of a phenomenon like political Islam, its origins, why it appeared, when it appeared, what its agenda is, the many different faces of political Islam, its adaptation, transformation, its connection to democratic movements, its connection to authoritarian movements. That is really the goal here in the attack to suffocate at the university level what academics are supposed to do. They're supposed to engage in research. They're supposed to do field work. They're supposed to look at things from different perspectives. They're supposed to challenge existing paradigms. The Islamophobic industry and people who attack centers such as ours are driven by this fanatical zeal where they don't want any nuance. They don't want any ambiguity. They just want one narrative, and it's a narrative that basically aligns with the politics of Netanyahu, the politics of Trump, the politics of other right-wing populist and fascist political groupings around the world. That's really what's driving a lot of this political behavior. Look, there's a lot more that I'd love to say, but we're past 1 o'clock now, and I know I have to run at 1:30, and I want to leave time for the audience to weigh in and ask questions. So I'll stop there, turn it back to Sahar, and look forward to the second part of the program.
Thank you, Professor Hashmi and Ms. Tazami. I'll ask for both of you to turn on your cameras. So the audience can use the Zoom Q&A function to ask questions. And I can't guarantee that all the questions will be answered, but we will try our best. While we wait for questions, I wanted to kind of not push back, but maybe clarify the statement that you made, Professor Hashmi, which I think is a fair statement, that the Islamophobia industry doesn't hate all Muslims. It only hates those who that threaten their political agendas, which we see that in any type of racial paradigm. Sometimes those folks are called model minorities. Sometimes they're called native informants. Sometimes they're called the house slave versus the field slave. So they're all that divide and conquer is very common. But I wanted to kind of point out a few things. The first is the people that the Islamophobia industry props up, right, as the Muslims that should represent all the diversity of Muslims, and none of us here claim to represent the diversity of Muslims. That in itself would be problematic for any identity group. But they are not scholars, and they are not people who were subjected to peer review in their production of knowledge, and they did not have to go through the rigor, right, of the academy. And that's something that's important, because just because someone claims to be an authoritative person on a subject doesn't mean they actually are. And that's obviously the whole point of the review and tenure process. And then the other thing I just wanted to clarify was the distinction between the Muslims abroad versus the Muslims here. I mean, I totally agree with you about wanting Muslim leaders abroad to effectively comply with U.S. hegemony. We saw that with Abdel Nasser during the Arab nationalist, era. But oftentimes the things that our centers work on are domestic, and it's really that focus on wanting to attack Muslims in the U.S. And even Arabs were mistaken as Muslim because there was just Arab American attorney, real estate attorney, who just got profiled, harassed, interviewed for 5 hours in the border of Vermont when he was coming for a weekend trip to Canada, celebrating Palm Sunday with his family. And he's Arab American Christian with U.S. citizenship. Right? And he even admitted in the news reports that he voted for Trump, but it doesn't matter because you've now been racially profiled. And similarly with the attorney, who I believe is a Muslim American attorney, who is coming through from the Dominican Republic into Detroit. And he had his iPhone confiscated and searched and so on and so forth. So the racial profiling does not care in that, on those nuances. But you make a fair point. Let me start with, so there's a question about the group called Betar. Who are they? What are they doing? And are their actions legal? Mubashir, do you want to start with that one?
Can't hear you.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Batar started, I believe, in the early 20th century. And it's very Zionist organization and kind of died down. But post October 7th, it's sprung back up in the US. It is very militant. If you look at them on social media, they advocate for violence. They praise the killing of Palestinian babies and children. And they have publicly been gathering lists of pro-Palestinian voices on US campuses and providing them to the Trump administration. I believe they had a profile, they had provided the name Mahmoud Halil and Rumeysa, and they take public credit for this stuff. And I think one of the shocking things about them is they're so public in their support for violence and the killing of Palestinians and support for the genocide, but social media companies have not. I think they were banned for a little bit by Meta, but then they were reinstated, and Twitter X under Musk really doesn't have any hate speech kind of limitations, so they're quite vocal on X. But yeah, they're a very militant organization. They advocate for violence against Palestinians and they're very public about it. And there's quite a few Washington Post, Al Jazeera, they've done a number of articles on the organization and providing a bit more on the background and a bit more of their leadership and who their leadership is and their connections to actually US politicians. I believe I think he stepped down in January, but his last name is Glick. He was originally head of it, and he had met with Fetterman of Pennsylvania and given him a pager. And if you know what that alludes to, it was alluding to the pager attack that Israel did in Lebanon. And they've also actually targeted Jewish Americans. So Peter Beinart, they also tweeted once about, hey, if you see Beinart in the neighborhood, give him a pager. So again, veiled death threats. And this is all publicly being done. And again, they're organizing lists of pro-Palestinian voices to give to the Trump administration to push for their deportations.
Yeah, I just want to add, it just so happens that yesterday I saw a very good, and I strongly recommend this, Al Jazeera documentary on Beitar, USA. They interviewed an Intercept journalist who spent a lot of time investigating this group. I strongly recommend it. I agree with everything that Mubashir said. I would just add that this organization, which is clearly, in my reading, a fascist organization, has now close political links with the Trump administration. And in fact, they have openly bragged about, when my colleague was arrested, that they were responsible for it, that they sort of, are taking credit for it. They're celebrating this. And if you go on the website, and the Al Jazeera documentary goes into this, they say that we work with ICE. And so you have a situation that highlights how broken our democracy is and why we are actually in an authoritarian moment, where you have organizations like Beitar, these right-wing fascist organizations, who effectively have the power to determine who can stay in this country and who can't. They identify a target, they send it to Marco Rubio, he sends in the shock troops, the person is in ICE detention facilities on his way out of the country. That's where we are in this country. And so these organizations have always existed, for a long time, but the difference now is they're emboldened and they feel this is a ripe opportunity to do what they've always wanted to do because they have allies in the White House.
I also want to add that there are multiple layers to the harm that's being caused by groups like Beitar and Canary Mission and these what we would call McCarthyistic, if we're going back to the Cold War era, forms of blacklisting, and now we have doxing, which due to social media and technological advances increases the risk of threats and physical safety threats exponentially. Is if the first layer, the most immediate victim, right, are people who are Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, South Asian, people from the global South, people who are mistaken for being Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian. And the important principle that we all need to keep in mind is you should be opposing this type of behavior and actions, not only because you humanize the victims and you believe that they are deserving of the very same rights, dignity, respect, safety as you deserve and your family and your friends, but even if that doesn't motivate you, even if you find those people you just have no sympathy for them, it's really important that we all think about what kind of society we are evolving into. And that as long as we all live in this society, we're all going to experience the consequences over the long run. It's just a matter of sooner rather than later. Do you want to live in a country where private groups, special interest groups, hate groups, and Betar, my understanding is it's established that they are actually based in Israel, and Canary Mission is also based in Israel, even if they may have U.S. Chapters, but that is not a secret or something that they hide. So you have private organizations that have foreign connections, wherever that foreign connection may be, who are effectively dictating to our government, the one we elect, specific practices and policies that are authoritarian, right? And that violate the US law, such as deporting Kilmar Abrego Garcia to El Salvador, when in fact he had a court order stating he could not be deported because he had a well-founded fear of persecution, and he was still going through the immigration process in attempting to adjust his status. This is just one example. Similar to Mahmoud Khalil, who had no criminal record, had a completely valid green card. There was absolutely no reason for him to be subjected to any kind of adverse action under the immigration legal system, and yet he was targeted by this private group that essentially demanded these unlawful acts. So just think about it from the broader long-term picture, because it really is a threat to our democratic system, in addition to just being individualized threats. Now, there is another question here that comes up quite a bit, and I think we can't avoid it. We don't have an expert on this issue in this panel, but we can always attempt to respond. The question is, how do we help disentangle the identities of Jewish people from Israeli government in the minds of the American public? We can't possibly take a step forward until people or voters can understand that a criticism of Israel as a state is completely different from that of the larger Jewish community. And so again, it's that issue of conflating Zionism with Judaism, and weaponizing by misinterpreting what constitutes anti-Semitism based on political analysis and critique of a nation state.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, it's a very important point. We don't have time to explore it, but the critique that I have, and I think most of us have, of what Israel is doing is a critique of state policy. It's a critique of politicians. It's a critique of a government. It's not a critique of an entire group of people. Now, the problem here is there are people here in the United States and in Israel who want to make it seem that our criticism of government policy and state policy is, in fact, a broader critique on an entire group of people for who they are. And that is a long-standing sort of trope or argument in the Israel-Palestine domain of politics and agitation, where there's an attempt to, in many ways, instrumentalize anti-Semitism to shield Israel from criticism and shift the discussion away from what Israel is doing as a state toward Palestinians, and to make it about racism and anti-Semitism. Yes, there's anti-Semitism that goes on. Every moral person should be against it. But this idea that just because you're criticizing a state, somehow you're criticizing an entire group of people. I mean, the analogy that I would use is, look, there's a lot of people that I know who are deeply attached to different Muslim governments, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran. When I criticize Saudi Arabia, when I criticize Iran, am I criticizing all Muslims? I mean, it's just ridiculous. When I criticize Modi in India, am I criticizing all Hindus? When we put it in that context, it's laughable. But for some reason, when it comes to the question of Israel-Palestine, we lose our objectivity. And, some people are sort of confused over, well, if I criticize Israel, is that actually anti-Semitic? No, it's not. The criticism is always a criticism of politicians, of state power. It's not a criticism of an entire group of people. Anyone who even goes in that direction, I think, needs to be outed and condemned. So that's, I think, the way to think about it. Thankfully, I think you're seeing these types of dissents happening within the American Jewish community, particularly among younger students. But I think the problem is that we have very loud and powerful voices that are deliberately trying to make this conflation. And I have to single out the ADL here, who now are sort of involved in this narrative that if you are critical of Israel, in other words, if you engage in, anti-Zionist criticism, well, that's really then a prelude to anti-Semitism or to genocide or things of that nature. And I think it's very important that we push back against that narrative, and we can distinguish between these two.
Bashar, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to add something about anti-Semitism in the sense that what Dr. Hashmi says, that a lot of pro-Israel and pro-Zionist voices instrumentalize and weaponize anti-Semitism. And I think a really good example of how it's being manipulated is recently the Israeli government held a conference on anti-Semitism, and they invited groups from across the globe. The people who attended were far-right groups from Europe, groups, political parties, and politicians who historically their parties have been leading anti-Semitism in Europe. So, for example, Jordan Bardella of the National Rally in France. He attended. Netanyahu recently met Viktor Orban of Hungary. Other individuals, you can look at a list, and there have been numerous articles talking about how this has been quite uncomfortable, given that a lot of these people historically are tied to parties whose origins are anti-Semitic, who pushed for anti-Semitic policies, who were part of the fascist far right of Europe. And these are the individuals that are coming to a conference on anti-Semitism in Israel. It's laughable to see that this is where it's come to. And I think that is a prime example of how anti-Semitism is being manipulated, it's being instrumentalized and weaponized. And it's a danger because anti-Semitism does exist, and it's largely coming from the far right. You have seen this from law enforcement in Europe, from security agencies in the US, Europe, across the world have said it's the far right that are largely being responsible for the rise in anti-Semitism, but no one is paying attention to that. It also dilutes the issue. I think we need to acknowledge that as well. So yeah, I think there needs to be a deep introspection of what is happening when we talk about anti-Semitism in this conversation.
I would just like to interject very quickly, sorry, that we need a separate program just on this topic. Because it's a big topic. Our center has done a lot of work actually on anti-Semitism and its links to Islamophobia. And now I think, this conversation, because the justification of the crackdown on universities is being done in the name of combating anti-Semitism, we need an entire program just on this topic.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm going to put a pitch in for a book that actually Mubashara has a chapter in, and Dr. John Esposito and I co-edited, called Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, because it discusses how the rise of right-wing populist groups in Europe, in Asia, in the US have fueled and increased Islamophobia across these various continents. And oftentimes, as Mubashara stated, these are the same groups who are quite openly anti-Semitic. And I think the real risk to both Muslim communities writ large and Jewish communities writ large, at least in the United States, is that this normalization of Islamophobia and the changes in laws and policies and norms, and the shift towards authoritarian practices is eventually going to hurt Jews in the long run, because anti-Semitism, I would argue, is much more deeply rooted in the US and has been in the US for much, much longer than Islamophobia, by virtue of immigration patterns and the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition that has theological origins of anti-Semitism, or at least anti-Semitic tropes. And this is what many Jewish Americans are starting to realize, even those who may identify as liberal Zionists, is that this allowing Zionism to be conflated with Judaism and allowing anti-Semitism to be weaponized, instrumentalized through the misinterpretation of what it is based on criticism of Israel is actually really, really dangerous for Jews, especially in the long run, and already even immediately against some Jewish professors and Jewish students and Jewish administrators who have also been fired and disciplined for their academic work and political viewpoints. So that is, we all have a shared destiny. We're all citizens of the same state. Our safety is interconnected, our security is interconnected, our dignity and respect is interconnected. And so it would be very foolish to think that you can just ignore or even support the oppression of one group in your society and think that it will never affect you, and that those societal structural changes won't come back and boomerang to harm you. Although I hope that it's not simply self-interest that causes us to work together and mobilize together. So before we end, I just want to give our speakers, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make before we end our panel?
Well, very quickly, look, my message to everyone who's willing to listen now is what we're experiencing now in the United States is just not a passing moment. We are in the middle of a clear and steady transition toward authoritarianism. The attacks that we're seeing on these young students, and in my case, Badr Khan Suri, is part of a clear authoritarian transition that, unless there's mobilization and pushback, it's only going to get worse. And so what we need now at this moment is many more meetings such as this, more teach-ins, more public rallies, more sort of these town hall meetings where, congressmen and women are being held to account. This is a critical moment. They first go after the low-hanging fruit. And if there's no pushback, then these authoritarian leaders in Washington, D.C. are only going to get emboldened. I also study authoritarianism, and there's a consensus now among scholars who study authoritarianism that what's happening right now in the United States is right out of the authoritarian playbook. Orban did it in Hungary. Erdogan is doing it right now and has been doing it in Turkey. Putin did it earlier. The only difference is, and the unique characteristic, is that it's happening with a much greater speed here in the United States than ever before. And so unless there is a concerted effort to push back against what's happening right now, we are going to find ourselves in a horrific situation where they're going to come after U.S. citizens, and they're already talking about it right now. So this is the alarm bells are ringing red. Everyone has to sort of, I think, come out and do what they can to put an end to this travesty, or else, we're going to find ourselves living in an authoritarian regime not too long. That's the message I want to sort of end with.
Mubashta?
Yeah, I'm co-signing everything Dr. Hashmi is saying. I think more of these sorts of conversations and more of a vocal pushback against what is happening is needed. This is definitely a moment where I don't think we've experienced this before. It is a turning point. We're only 4 months in, 3-4 months into this administration, and look at what's happened. So yeah, and I think just educating ourselves as individuals and as citizens, and having our voices be heard is very, very important, but also know your rights. And I think, Professor Aziz, thank you for pointing all of that out. I think that's so valuable in understanding our rights as citizens. And also, check out our centers, check out our resources. We've produced so many reports and articles and on this stuff. It's not something we did yesterday. We've been doing this for years. But yeah, just definitely be educated and be alert and be vocal.
Thank you both. And I will end by reminding everyone that the best way to protect your free speech rights is to exercise them. The best way to protect your academic freedom rights is to exercise them. And to also protect the same rights of those around you, regardless how much you may personally dislike them or may disagree with them. There is no such thing as rights for them and no rights for them and rights for us. So we do need to be thinking about the principles that we stand for. And I would encourage everyone who benefited from this program, who finds the research, the programs, the conferences that the Center for Security, Race and Rights hosts, the Bridge Initiative hosts, or the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding hosts, I encourage you to make a donation to those centers. At csrr.rutgers.edu, you can press the donate button. You can go to the websites of the Bridge Initiative or the ACMCU and make a donation there. So one way is keep supporting the work that you find beneficial and that is informative, because money does talk, and it also allows us to do more of this important work, which again is not intended to make you categorically agree with us. It is not intended to indoctrinate or brainwash. It is intended to inform and to trigger your critical thinking skills, and ideally cause you to do more research, to read more, of different perspectives so that you can be the type of citizen that the Supreme Court wants in supporting academic freedom, an informed citizenry, a citizenry that has critical thinking skills, and one that is not afraid to think, to act, to speak freely within the bounds of the law. And so with that, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be on April 23rd, entitled Coming Out as Dalit, A Memoir of Surviving India's Caste System. And you can register for that at csrr.rutgers.edu. Thank you, and ma salama.